I would like now to invite the bride, Anat Rosenberg, to respond, and later I hope we'll have left several minutes to Q&A.
Thanks so much. This has been such fun. It's unbelievable to have something relatively normal after 3 months of complete lack of normality, and it's almost a miracle. I'm very conscious of your time on a Friday morning. We won't be going on for long. I'm not going to do justice to these wonderful comments and questions. I will instead try to give you a sort of broad view and take the comments up in order to say some general things about my past and future thinking about the history of advertising and the history of capitalism generally, and hopefully do some but not full justice to this. So what I've done is, for the benefit of, I'm sure, just one or two people here who have not read the book, is just brought in a couple of images from the book to give you a sense of what advertising looked like in the 19th century and the early 20th century, which may not be obvious, where what we have here is a print culture mainly, but not only. So these would be newspapers of the 19th century, and you can see the rise of the visual image in advertising in this comparison between the 70s and the 90s. And then we have a whole other or additional culture of advertising, which is in vehicles, in carriages, on the streets, and you can see the proportions of people to adverts to get a sense of the effective charge that I write a lot about. And of course the ephemera, the small leaflets that were being handed out and posted in the mail. And there's also a whole performative world of advertising. So this is the first British airship that was flown as an advertisement for Millings Food, for a well-known brand. So this is the general atmosphere of an onslaught of a new system. Now, I want to pick up a few points from the comments we've heard that I was writing as I was listening to you. So one point is about law. This is a book about law and advertising, but it is not about the law with as an identifiable and coherent field, but rather about law as people use it in everyday life. Which means the law did not have to be anything. It did not have to be enchanted or disenchanted in particular ways. And that goes back to Peter's comment. Why do we see here a different relationship between legal treatments of enchantment in this case, and in my previous book, legal treatments of the extra-contractual elements of marriage? My answer to that would be, or an initial thought, because I hadn't compared the books as well as Peter just has, but my response to that would be because there is nothing inherent in law having to ignore or not particular elements that we call non-legal or extra-legal. Rather, this is an active normative choice, which is what made it interesting for me in this book, to not treat enchantment, to disavow it, to look at it or to not look at it, is not a failure or an inability of either elite legal professionals or of other legal actors. It is an active normative choice that only succeeded in the context of advertising because so many people were committed to it. So that commitment was not only the commitment of judges who did not want to talk about enchantment in the economy, and not only of lawyers who were not possibly trained to talk about enchantment or to conceptualize enchantment in the economy. It was also the way everyday people, in the way they managed their private property, their labor relationships, their contractual contexts, the way they managed those things involved an active disavowal of enchantment. There was nothing inherent about law that demanded this kind of response, but rather a commitment of an entire culture when it reflected actively on its own condition to tell about itself a story of disenchantment, right? So, and this also goes to the point of, was it the elite versus the masses who were not so worried? Nobody was very worried until they were invited in some form of context to an active reflection, at which point we see an active form of disavowal that I find very interesting, and so it became a book. I love the term affective liberalism. I should have used it. Moving on to the question of what is going on today, has this remained, or has law had to face more seriously the expanding enchantments of advertising as an economic system? The answer is, of course, it has had to face them, and in some areas of law, I think we see more willingness or development of concepts of enchantment, but they remain very limited. So what we see today, for example, is a lot of the language of behaviorism, and the idea of the ideas in psychology which talk about cognitive biases. Now, my problem with the language of biases is that it is a language of failure. It is about something that is absent, right? Rationality is absent. In predictable ways, we can talk about the ways it is going to be absent, but we don't have a positive description of the contents of fantasy. And since fantasy is such a driver, and imagination, they're such drivers of economic development and of everyday life, we need to be able to also cover those contents. And that's something that I think we might be doing in some areas better than we have in the past, particularly in the management of competition between brands, but not so much in other contexts, particularly not when it comes to our description of consumers. So I think there we're still not doing great, and again, I think we need to treat this not as an inability of legal thinking, but rather as normative choices of cultures. Rachel, I love the idea of a description of the book as a retro book. I'm going to embrace that. To the contradictions or tensions that you recognize, I would also add trying to provide a rational or at least understandable account of enchantment. I think there's an inherent tension in that project as well that I accept and have been trying to manage. One thing to add about, let me go back to newspapers and the classifieds, right? So they often look very banal and informative. These are just words. They're often in different categories. But their impact comes not only on the level of their individual content, but en masse, right? So as their accumulation is where fantasies of mobility, including Jane Eyre's as a very early articulation, begin to happen, which is why I am as interested in the seemingly boring and informational adverts as I am in the sort of sensational, image-based posters that are associated with mass advertising. Again, to the question of what what is happening today with digital advertising and whether we're going back to the past of individualized, tailored advertising. We certainly are. It's also the case with attacks on quackery providing individualized medicine. Now it's coming back, right? And it's become part of regular medicine as well. So we see this back and forth. I think that's absolutely true. One of the interesting things to think about here is the fact that in order to keep worlds of imagination or enchantment or fantasy alive, in conditions in which knowledge is readily available, we have to reject knowledge actively. And so in order to keep dreaming today, we need to not know everything that is available for knowing. And so in order to research our own times, what we would need to do is see how, I don't have immediate answers, but we would need to see how we're managing the knowledge economy that is surrounding us now, and what we're rejecting and what we're taking with us. So this is about moving to the future that has come up. What about moving geographically? Erica, I hope you're hearing us, but I particularly appreciate the question about the empire. Of course, it is important, and hopefully, in some senses, will come into what might be my next book. I've become interested in what happened in Israel as well, and I might start with pre-Israel Palestine to see how advertising emerged here. We don't have legal histories of advertising in Israel at all. Clearly, we can see, for example, from histories of advertising in late colonial India, we see different regimes of commercial ethnographies that are going on, and it is important to study them. I appreciate the comment about the method. I hope this is a method of studying advertising, not only by trying to interpret advertisements from our own perspective today. What I've tried to do throughout this book is look at reception and not only offer my own interpretations of images and texts. And finally, Roy, to your question, so what Roy is saying, I think is really important, because by the time I finished writing this book, I realized I knew too little about enchantment. Having spent a few years trying to understand it, I thought, this is just the beginning. What if capitalism is premised on enchantments, on fantasies and imaginations, in much more structural ways than we realize? I think that's true, and so what I did is create a research network to study enchantment in the history of capitalism and try to create more consistent histories of systems of the economy and the way enchantment is built into them in economic theory, and that came up again. So Veblen and later other theorists who have been arguing basically production is pulling itself by its own strings. If it has to create the demand, what is the justification of production, right? So that question about the justification of the whole system, not just consumers, I think is certainly important, and I'm going to take it forward. Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else I wanted to say? No, I think the one thing I wanted to do is maybe do justice to this image you've been seeing. I don't know how well you can see here. This is the image on the book's cover is from a painting of John O'Connor from 1884. And I think you can't see enough here, despite the high resolution, but it's full of advertisements, both on the walls of buildings and on the buses, and with people carrying them on the side, the so-called sandwich man. What's interesting about it is you can recognize a romantic construction, right? I mean, the romantic sky of which is easily recognizable. It is receding, it's disappearing. The new form of romance is adverts on the streets, which are patches of color. And that is the reason it's been interesting to me, and that is why it ended up on the cover. I think I'll stop here if we can take a couple of questions, and then I'll say something to end. And yeah?